Folks, imagine walking into your grocery store at the end of the month only to find empty shelves where your favorite foods used to be. What's happening, and why are these essentials disappearing right before our eyes? In this video, we're going to uncover 9 foods that will be nearly impossible to find by the end of the month. We'll explain the surprising reasons behind these shortages, from climate change to strikes at major ports, and how it all affects your next grocery trip. By the end of this video, you'll be better prepared for what's to come. Stay tuned, as you won't want to miss the everyday items that could soon disappear from your kitchen. Trust me, it's more serious than you think. Welcome to Prepper Pantry, our platform dedicated to keeping you informed on all things that matter. If you're new here, please subscribe and click the super thanks button to support our content and stay up to date. Let's start with one of the biggest reasons certain foods are becoming scarce: port strikes. While shopping for groceries, you may not realize that a significant portion of our food comes from imports. Major shipping ports striking workers strand everything from fruits to seafood at the docks, awaiting unloading. Let's start with a food that's part of almost every household: bananas. Did you know that more than 75% of bananas consumed in the US are imported? And a large portion of these shipments come through East Coast and Gulf Coast ports. When dock workers go on strike, these bananas are stuck at sea or waiting in shipping containers, unable to be unloaded. As a result, many of these bananas either spoil or arrive too late to be sold. So, what happens? Fewer bananas in the store and higher prices for what's available. In fact, according to recent reports, some major retailers are already struggling to restock bananas, and we can expect to see them vanish entirely in certain regions if the strikes continue. Seafood is another category that's heavily impacted. The U.S. imports more than 85% of its seafood, with a lot of it coming through coastal ports on the east and west coasts. Strikes at these ports mean imports of fish like salmon, shrimp, and crab are significantly delayed. Now, seafood is highly perishable, meaning it doesn't have much time to sit around. Every day lost in transit increases the likelihood of spoilage, driving up prices as supplies become limited. Restaurants, particularly seafood joints, are already feeling the pinch, with some even adjusting their menus due to shortages. The fresh seafood that does make it to stores and restaurants might come at a premium price, or worse, there may be none available at all. But port strikes don't just affect imported foods. Take beef, for example. While much of the beef sold in the U.S. is produced domestically, many retailers rely on specific beef cuts from international suppliers to meet demand, particularly during times of high consumption. The strikes are choking the supply chain, delaying these beef imports, which is expected to create shortages in certain cuts like high-end steaks and roasts. And when supply is limited, you guessed it, prices go up. So not only will it become harder to find your favorite cuts of beef, but you'll also be paying a lot more for what's left. Another lesser-known impact of these strikes: canned and processed foods. It's not just fresh produce and meats that get delayed. Many processed foods rely on imported ingredients or come from factories overseas. Items like canned tuna, certain fruits, and even vegetables could start disappearing from store shelves as the backlog of containers grows at the ports. The longer the strikes go on, the harder it will be to keep these items in stock. What's even more concerning is that there doesn't seem to be an end in sight for these labor disputes. As workers fight for better pay and working conditions, negotiations can drag on for weeks, sometimes months. This means that these disruptions to the food supply chain could continue well into the future, potentially affecting even more items as time goes on. And while these port strikes might feel like they're happening far from home, the ripple effects hit close to home, right in your local grocery store, affecting the foods you depend on. Even if you live miles away from the nearest port, your dinner table is more connected to global shipping than you might realize. So, what can you do? Well, being aware of these looming shortages is the first step. Consider stocking up on items that could be affected, like non-perishable goods, canned foods, or frozen alternatives, which may become harder to find as fresh supplies dwindle. And keep an eye on local markets, as they tend to get hit first when these supply chain issues take hold. Port strikes might not seem like a big deal to the average consumer, But the truth is, they can quickly lead to empty shelves and higher prices. It's a powerful reminder of just how fragile our global food supply chain really is. Now, let's move on to another major issue that's affecting the food we eat: environmental factors. Climate change and extreme weather events are starting to hit our food supply in ways many people aren't aware of, but the impact is real. Droughts, floods, and even unusual temperature shifts are drastically reducing the availability of certain foods, and the effects might be more widespread than you think. One of the most concerning examples is wheat. Wheat is a staple crop, and it's used in everything from bread to pasta. But right now, wheat production is under serious pressure. In major wheat-producing countries like the US, Canada, and parts of Europe, extreme weather conditions, especially drought, are shrinking harvests. In 2023, North America saw some of its worst wheat yields in decades because of prolonged droughts and heat waves. These extreme weather patterns are cutting down supply, and this means that by the end of the month, products that rely on wheat, like flour and bread, could see price increases and even shortages. And it's not just wheat. Other grains like barley and oats are also struggling, which could hit your breakfast cereal, beer, and even pet food. Next, let's talk about something millions of people rely on every day to kickstart their mornings: coffee. Coffee is incredibly sensitive to weather conditions, and unfortunately, climate change is making it harder to grow. In countries like Brazil and Colombia, two of the largest coffee exporters in the world, rising temperatures and unpredictable rain patterns are slashing coffee yields. Some regions that were once prime for coffee farming are becoming unsuitable because of drought, excessive rainfall, or even frost in areas that should be warm. This means fewer beans being harvested, which translates to higher prices and potential shortages of your favorite morning brew. We've already seen coffee prices spike over the last few years, and if these environmental patterns continue, we could be looking at a future where good coffee is harder to find and costs a lot more. Another surprising item being hit hard by environmental changes is spices. Yes, the spices that add flavor to your meals are in trouble too. Take black pepper and cinnamon, for example. These spices come from regions like India and Vietnam, where erratic weather caused by climate change is affecting crops. Black pepper production in Vietnam has been struggling due to unpredictable rainfall and longer dry seasons, while cinnamon, mostly grown in Indonesia and Sri Lanka, is also facing challenges due to changing climates and deforestation. This means that by the end of the month, you might see a lot fewer options for these common spices on the shelves, or notice that prices have jumped significantly. These aren't items people think about every day, but if you enjoy cooking, you'll certainly feel the impact of these shortages in your kitchen. And let's not forget about fruits and vegetables. Crops like tomatoes, lettuce, and avocados are extremely vulnerable to changes in weather patterns. For example, tomato crops in California, one of the largest tomato-producing regions in the world, have been severely affected by droughts in recent years. California's Central Valley produces more than a quarter of the world's tomatoes, and with water becoming scarcer, farmers are planting fewer crops, or worse, seeing them wither in the fields. The same goes for lettuce and avocados, which are both sensitive to temperature changes and water shortages. So, if you're a fan of fresh salads or guacamole, you might want to keep an eye out because these items could be in short supply and more expensive very soon. Beyond that, there's also the threat of pollinators disappearing. This may not be on everyone's radar, but declining bee populations, driven by habitat loss and pesticide use, are starting to affect crops that rely on pollination, things like almonds, apples, and berries. Without enough bees to pollinate these crops, production slows down, and that leads to shortages of some of your favorite fruits and nuts. Almonds, in particular, could be at risk since they heavily depend on bees for pollination, and California, the world's largest almond producer, has already seen issues with both bee health and drought. Environmental factors like climate change, extreme weather, and pollinator decline are creating a perfect storm for food shortages. What makes this even more alarming is that many of these impacts don't just last for a season, they could be long-term. When the environment shifts, it can take years or even decades for farmers to adapt, and some areas may never recover. So, what can you do? Start thinking about alternatives. Maybe that means trying different grains, stocking up on spices when you can find them, or even growing your own herbs at home if you have the space. Paying attention to where your food comes from and supporting sustainable farming practices can also make a difference. But one thing is clear: environmental changes are reshaping the food landscape, and what we take for granted today could be much harder to come by tomorrow. Now let's dive into one of the biggest and often overlooked reasons behind food shortages: economic and political factors. While environmental issues and supply chain disruptions grab headlines, a lot of what determines what shows up in your grocery store is directly tied to the complex global economy and political decisions. Tariffs, inflation, trade wars, and even government regulations can have a serious impact on the availability and cost of food. Let's explore some of the everyday items that are feeling the squeeze due to these factors. One of the most immediate impacts we're seeing is on dairy products. Over the last couple of years, the cost of feed and energy for dairy farms has skyrocketed. This means it's become far more expensive for farmers to produce milk, cheese, butter, and other dairy staples. In places like the US and Europe, farmers are also struggling with labor shortages, as fewer people are working in agriculture due to the difficult conditions and low pay. Many farms have had to cut back on production or, in some cases, shut down entirely. As a result, the prices of milk, cheese, and butter have been steadily rising, and by the end of the month, we could start seeing shortages on store shelves, especially of premium or organic dairy products. This situation is even worse in regions where dairy production is heavily regulated by government policies, which can limit imports or add additional costs to production. Another food item that's been hit hard by economic challenges is eggs. The price of eggs has been all over the place recently, and this isn't just because of inflation. Earlier this year, there were several major salmonella outbreaks that led to the culling of millions of chickens. When a farm experiences an outbreak, entire flocks have to be destroyed to prevent the spread of the disease, which drastically reduces the supply of eggs. Add to this the rising cost of feed and energy, and you've got a perfect storm of higher prices and lower availability. In certain regions, egg shortages are already being reported, and depending on where you live, you may see empty shelves by the end of the month, especially for organic and free-range eggs, which are more sensitive to supply chain disruptions. Canned goods are another category being heavily affected by economic and political factors. You'd think that with all the advanced technology and manufacturing we have today, something as simple as canned soup or vegetables wouldn't be a problem, right? But here's the thing. Many of the metals used to produce cans, like aluminum and steel, are subject to global supply and demand fluctuations, tariffs, and trade wars. The cost of these raw materials has been rising, and combined with supply chain disruptions, it's making it harder and more expensive to produce and transport canned goods. In fact, during the height of the pandemic, we saw a spike in demand for canned foods, which hasn't really slowed down, putting even more pressure on the supply chain. On top of that, many canned goods rely on imported ingredients, which face additional tariffs or trade restrictions depending on where they're sourced. The result? Higher prices for basic pantry staples like canned vegetables, soups, beans, and even tuna, with some items potentially disappearing from stores altogether if the situation worsens. Another area where political factors come into play is with import restrictions and trade wars. A lot of countries have imposed tariffs on imported goods, including food items, as part of ongoing trade disputes. Take, for example, the tariffs imposed between the US and China in recent years. Products like soybeans, pork, and certain fruits have been caught in the crossfire, leading to disruptions in both supply and pricing. Soybeans, in particular, are a key ingredient in a lot of processed foods and animal feed. When trade relations break down, the supply of these essential ingredients becomes unstable, driving up the cost of producing everything from tofu to farm-raised meats. Speaking of meats, pork is another food that's been hit by a combination of economic and political factors. In countries like China, where pork is a staple, an outbreak of African swine fever devastated pig populations, forcing China to rely heavily on imports to meet demand. But due to trade restrictions and tariffs, the flow of pork into the US and other countries has been inconsistent. This has caused price hikes and shortages in the international pork market, affecting the availability of pork products at your local store. You may notice that certain cuts, like bacon or pork chops, are becoming pricier and harder to find. Another issue tied to economic factors is the rising cost of transportation. Food prices are often closely linked to the cost of fuel and shipping. As gas prices fluctuate, the cost of transporting food from farms to warehouses and, ultimately, to your local grocery store can increase significantly. Over the past year, rising fuel costs have made it more expensive to move goods across the country and even across borders. These increased transportation costs are passed down to consumers, meaning you'll be paying more at the register for things like fresh produce, meats, and dairy. And in some cases, if the costs become too high, certain items might not even make it to the shelves at all, especially in remote areas where transportation is already more difficult. Lastly, let's not forget about economic sanctions. In some cases, countries place sanctions on each other, cutting off the flow of goods, including food. A prime example is the ongoing sanctions placed on Russia due to the war in Ukraine. Both of these countries are major exporters of grains, oils, and fertilizers. With sanctions in place, the flow of these essential commodities has been drastically reduced, leading to global shortages and price hikes. In particular, sunflower oil and wheat have been hit hard by this conflict, impacting the availability of these products not just in Europe but globally. If you use sunflower oil in cooking, you may want to stock up while you still can because the supply chain disruptions from this political conflict are expected to continue. Economic and political factors may not be as obvious as environmental issues, but their impact on the food supply can be just as dramatic. From dairy and eggs to canned goods and pork, the cost of food is rising due to trade restrictions, tariffs, labor shortages, and more. Staying informed about these underlying forces can help you prepare for shortages and price hikes in the coming months. As we've seen, food shortages are being driven by a variety of factors: port strikes, environmental changes, and economic or political turmoil. Whether it's fresh produce, dairy, or even pantry staples like canned goods, many of the foods we rely on could become harder to find by the end of the month. But being informed and staying prepared can help you navigate these challenges, ensuring that you're not caught off guard when you visit the grocery store. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and share it with others who might benefit from this information. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more insights like this, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Also, feel free to drop a comment below if you have any questions or thoughts. We appreciate your support and look forward to keeping you informed.